And welcome to our third and final night of coverage, our on-foot Jack the Ripper tour. I know I've gone a lot more in depth into it than our first one, so that was something I wanted to do. It may have been a little bit too much for some of you, but I hope you've all found it interesting, because I wanted this done to the best of my ability. Those ladies deserve that, without any elaborations or hype or untruths even. I've, to the best of my ability, tried to make this as honest and truthful as possible. We're heading from the Whitechapel area in towards Spitalfields now, and I'm going to take you along Toynbee Street. And you'll remember Jack the Chipper, fish and chip shop. I'm going to take you to something along those lines, where I want to discuss with you two events that happened in between the night of the double murder and the night of the last canonical or acknowledged murder, which, I'm going to be honest with you, I've issued trigger warnings where they're needed, and I'm going to give you one now. What you will see with Mary Jane Kelly is effing brutal, absolutely brutal. Toynbee Street. I hope that was a reflection in my glasses. I've had some interesting events occur during the course of this series, which I know has taken me quite some time to get done. I'm sorry about that. It's where I've been ill, it's where I've been quiet recently. I'm back on the mend. We walk past the Duke of Wellington pub. And we are now at the also extremely tastefully named Jack the Clipper. Barbers, of course. And on subjects of barbers and goriness and things like that, we must hark back to the most famous evil barber of all, an urban legend, the demon barber Sweeney Todd, who kept his establishment on Fleet Street, and who would occasionally slit the throats of his customers. Had a mechanism in his chair that would tip the chair back, and they would pop down into the cellar, where he had a tunnel that led over to Mrs. Lovett's pie shop, where those poor murdered people would be turned into pies, which was very tasty apparently. But as was explained to us on our tour with Matt, barber shops and these things here, the barbershop sign, the reason they exist is in medieval times you had barber surgeons, and a barber surgeon would be a barber to cut your hair and shave you, but also would perform surgeries on you, bloodletting mostly, tooth pulling, things like that. And how they first started advertising themselves was to leave bowls of blood outside their shop, which became rapidly stinky even for the medieval era. So it must have been bad for them to not like that. So what they did was put blood-soaked bandages outside their shops, which would wave in the wind, giving us this red and white twirly effect that we have nowadays. And the reason that some of them have blue in them, some say it's to make them more English, like a Union Jack, and others say it's to denote members of blue blood, the aristocracy. Because in those days, in the medieval times, the aristocracy, particularly the women, tried to keep their skin as pale as possible. They didn't like to go out, so their skin would be very pale, making their veins show up blue, giving you the term of blue-blooded. But on the term of gimmicks and the name, I mean, we see Jack the Clipper here, but the name of Jack the Ripper, I'm going to take you to two events now that occurred between the 1st of September, so just one day after the double murder, and 1st of October and the 15th of October, so just one day after the double murder. So I'll take you to the Saucy Jackie postcard and a letter from hell. And in the world of 1888, it's just 24 hours after the double murder. And the Saucy Jackie postcard. The Saucy Jackie postcard is the name given to a postcard received by the Central News Agency of London and postmarked the 1st of October 1888. The author of the postcard claims to have been the unidentified serial killer known as Jack the Ripper. Because there were so many hoax letters received by Scotland Yard, the press and others, it is unknown whether this is an authentic letter written by the Whitechapel murderer himself. The postcard did contain information deemed compelling enough to lead investigators to publish a facsimile of the communication in hopes that someone might recognise the handwriting. The text of the postcard reads, and I shall read it out as he wrote it: "I was not codding, dear old boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number 1 squealed a bit. Couldn't finish straight off. That's Elizabeth Stride he's talking about. Had not time to get the ears off for the police. Thanks for keeping the last letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper." Postmarked and received on Monday the 1st of October 1888, the postcard mentions that the two victims murdered on the 30th of September, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, both of whom were killed in the early hours of the morning of September the 30th, 1888, and that the author had insufficient time to sever the victims' ears to send to the police, as he'd promised to do in a previous letter, the Dear Boss letter, also received by the Central News Agency of London. The Loban oracle of Catherine Eddowes' right ear was found detached at the crime scene as a result of the facial mutilations that the killer had performed, although this was not public knowledge. Some authors have argued that the postcard was sent before the murders were publicised, making it unlikely that any hoaxer would have such knowledge of the crime. However, the correspondence was postmarked around 24 hours after the killings had occurred, and long after many of the details of the murders were known to journalists and residents of the local areas. Police officials later claimed to have identified the specific journalist as the author of the postcard and the earlier Dear Boss letter. In 1931, a journalist, Fred Best of the Star, claimed that he and a colleague at the newspaper had written all the letters signed Jack the Ripper in order to keep business alive and keep the story going. In the years after the Ripper murders, the Saucy Jackie postcard disappeared from police files, although the Dear Boss letter was recovered in 1987. The Saucy Jackie postcard is still missing and only facsimile copies survive. In 2018, forensic linguistic analysis found Strong linguistic evidence suggesting that this postcard and the Dear Boss letter were written by the same hand. And now, a letter from hell. The From Hell letter, also known as the Lusk letter, was a letter sent with half a preserved human kidney to George Lusk, the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, in October 1888. The author of this letter claimed to be the unidentified serial killer known as Jack the Ripper. The letter was postmarked the 15th of October 1888 and was received by Mr. Lusk the following day at his home. An examination of the kidney revealed that the individual from whom the organ had originated had suffered from Bright's disease. The author of the letter claimed to have fried and eaten the other half of the kidney. A contemporary police lead found that a shopkeeper, Emily Marsh, had encountered a visitor at her shop located in Mile End Road, with an odd, unsettling manner in both appearance and speech. The visitor asked Marsh for the address of Mr. Lusk, which he wrote down in a personal notebook before abruptly leaving. He was described as a slim man, wearing a long black overcoat, about 6 feet in height, who spoke with a distinct Irish accent, his face featuring a dark beard and moustache. And that was the man that is also said to have delivered the nasty little box and its letter to Mr. Lusk. And here is a picture I took in the Jack the Ripper Museum, which is a recreation of what Mr. Lusk received. A box containing a half-preserved human kidney and a letter from hell. And a photograph of the copy, now lost, from Hell letter postmarked 15th of October 1888. And the text of the letter from hell reads, From Hell, Mr. Lusk, Saw, I send you half a human kidney. I took from one woman, preserved it for you. T'other piece I ate, it was very nice. I may send the bloody knife that took it out, if only you wait a while longer. Signed, Catch Me If You Can. In 1888, police, press and public alike received many letters claiming to be from the Whitechapel murderer, with investigators at one stage having to deal with an estimated 1,000 letters related to the case. However, the From Hell letter is one of the few articles of correspondence that has received serious consideration as to actually being genuine. Nonetheless, opinions remain divided as regards to the letter's authenticity. The letter came into the possession of the City of London Police, being later transferred to the Metropolitan Police. The original letter and the kidney which accompanied it have since been lost or stolen, along with other contents that were contained in the Metropolitan Police Ripper files. But a photograph was taken of the From Hell letter. The original of this photograph has now disappeared. The image shown here is one of that photograph, so a photograph of a photograph. And the images I took in the Jack the Ripper Museum. Now, we'll continue back on foot as we carry on with our Jack the Ripper tour. So join me back on the East End streets as off we go. As we leave Jack the Clipper behind, all was quiet between the 15th of October, when Mr. Lusk received the letter from hell, and the 8th of November. And then on Friday the 9th of November 1888 would come the 5th canonical and most brutal of all the murders. And it's on the night of Friday the 9th of November 1888 that I'll walk you in the footsteps and last journey of the final lady I'll cover on this on foot tour series. So off we go. into the heart of Spitalfields. And the view we shall see has not changed, other than the modern street furniture and electricals and things like that, since 1888. And this one here is a great little view for us, really, because it was the Queen's Head pub. It's a coffee bar now. Sorry, no it isn't. It was a coffee bar. It is Chris Dyson Architects now, I beg your pardon. It was the Queen's Head. It was a coffee bar. But this was the location, the Queen's Head, that Elizabeth Stride was last seen drinking in. So that's where Elizabeth Stride was last seen. And this is where we start getting the very same views as Our Ladies and Jack the Ripper. This is Christchurch, Spitalfields. When you walk past, you'll see the lights on in its crypt and its churchyard gate open. That is because that crypt, which offered a refuge to people in the Second World War, offers a warm space and refuge to people now. Rather than victims of war, it's victims of homelessness. And this here is the 10 Bells pub. Most strongly associated with Annie Chapman and our last victim that we're going to be covering, Mary Jane Kelly, or Mary Jeanette Kelly, as her name appears on her memorial stone in the cemetery. But this is the 10 Bells pub where Mary Jane Kelly, and very likely as well Jack the Ripper, was seen. We know that Mary Jane Kelly was certainly here, and she was seen leaving from this direction over to where we're going to be going in a minute, the murder site. And yeah, the details I shall give you now. Mary Jane Kelly, and she was the most mysterious of all the 5 canonicals. So little was known about her, even her early life. Mary Jane was about 25 years old in 1888, and although her origins are obscure, there was something more of the refined about Mary Jane. This is the famously historic Fernier Street, which we did walk down, didn't we, when we went to the site of Annie Chapman's murder, and right at the very end of it there is Brick Lane. But when Mary Jane and Jack the Ripper possibly left the pub, this is the very view they would have seen, apart from that there. Spitalfields Market, the 10 Bells pub, and Christchurch, Spitalfields, all of which were here in 1888. Spitalfields Market was just 1 year old in 1888, having been built in 1887. So yeah, it's a pretty iconic location, this one. So that's where she was last seen drinking. And I'm now going to be taking you over to the site of the murder. A lost pub was here, and old shops. I'll just pause you while I cross this over. Crossing this over now, getting our last glimpse of the 10 bells. And I wonder, did Mary Jane look back? She was seen with a man at night and heading towards her room, and told the person that saw her that she was going to be singing him some Irish songs. This is Brushfield Street. All this would have been there in 1888. This most certainly would not have been. And drop my notes. We're heading towards what was in 1888 Dorset Street and Miller's Court. Getting our last view of Spitalfields Market and the 10 bells. And although in our time, we celebrate our Christmas very early, in Victorian times still, I mean, the tradition was to put your decorations up on Christmas Eve and take them down on the 6th of January on 12th night. But here, where these brass rods go across the floor, that was the site of Dorset Street, and just roughly where these elevators are was Miller's Court. And it was at the site of that Miller's Court where Jack the Ripper would perform what was the most brutal and awful of the 5 canonicals or acknowledged murders. So, before we go off into that a little bit, the last song that Mary Jane Kelly was heard to have been singing on her last night, I'm going to play to you now. And the last song she was heard to be singing is called A Violet Plucked from Mother's Grave. And you'll hear it in Jack. And as sad as that was, I thought it was important to play it in the place where it would have occurred. And now we're going to go more off into the life of Mary Jane Kelly and her murder. So off we go for that.
Mary Jane Kelly, also known as Marie Jeanette, and she is the most mysterious of our ladies. Everything about her is kind of shrouded in mystery and ifs and maybes, even down to her age when she died and when and where she was born. She was born in circa 1863, possibly in Limerick in Ireland. She was possibly married. She definitely had relationships, but she was murdered on Friday the 9th of November 1888. And what you're seeing is a contemporary image of Mary Jane from the newspapers, because there are no known photographs of Mary Jane Kelly. But this one here that you'll find in the casebook of Jack the Ripper forums is alleged to be a photograph of Mary Jane Kelly, so we are possibly looking upon the face of Mary Jane Kelly. And compared with the other 4 canonical Ripper victims, Mary Jane Kelly's origins are obscure and undocumented, and much of this information is possibly embellished. Mary Jane may have fabricated many details of her early life, as there is no corresponding documentary evidence, but there is also no evidence to the contrary either. According to Joseph Barnett, the man she had most recently lived with prior to the murder, she had told him that she was born in Limerick in Ireland in around 1863, although whether she referred to the city or the county is not known, and that her family moved to Wales when she was a child. Mary Jane is known to have claimed to acquaintances that her parents had disowned her, although she remained in close terms with her sister. She described her family to Barnett as moderately wealthy, and both he and former landlady of Mary Jane's, Mrs. Carthy, claimed that she came from a family of well-to-do people. Barnett reported that Mary Jane informed him her father's name was John Kelly, and that he worked in an ironworks, either in Carnarvonshire or Carmarthenshire in Wales. Barnett also recalled Mary Jane mentioning having 7 brothers and at least 1 sister. She once stated to a friend named Lizzie Aldbrook that a female family member of hers was employed at the London theatrical stage. Her landlord, Mr. John McCarthy, also claimed that Mary Jane received infrequent correspondence from Ireland. Mrs. Carthy described Mary Jane as being an excellent scholar and an artist of no mean degree. However, at the inquest into her murder, Barnett informed the coroner that in the months prior to her murder, she had often asked him to read newspaper reports of the Whitechapel murders to her, suggesting that she was illiterate. Contemporary reports estimate Mary Jane's height to be around 5'7". Detective Walter Dew, in his autobiography, claimed to have known her well by sight. He described her as quite attractive and a pretty buxom girl. According to Dew, she always wore a clean white apron, but never wore a hat. When Mary Jane was aged approximately 16, in about 1879, she reportedly married a coal miner named Davies, who was killed 2 or 3 years later in a mining explosion. Without any means of financial support, she relocated to Cardiff, where she lived with a cousin. Although there are no contemporary records of Mary Jane's presence in Cardiff, it is at this stage in her life that she is considered to have begun her career as a professional prostitute, possibly being introduced to this profession by her cousin. No South Wales police records exist to indicate that Mary Jane was arrested for prostitution while in Wales. In 1884, Mary Jane apparently left Cardiff and relocated to London, where she briefly worked at a tobacconist's in Chelsea. And that was before securing employment as a domestic servant while living in lodgings in Goulston Street, Spitalfields. The following year, she is believed to have relocated to London's central district of Fitzrovia. Via her acquaintance with a Frenchwoman she had met in Knightsbridge, she found work in a high-class brothel in the more affluent West End of London. She became one of the brothel's most popular girls and spent her earnings on expensive clothing and hiring a carriage. Reportedly, Mary Jane was invited by a client named Francis Craig to France, where she was employed at a brothel there, but she returned to England within approximately 2 weeks, having disliked her life there. However, by the time of her return to London, Mary Jane had adopted the French name of Marie Jeanette. And it's no mean feat. We were told in Matt's tour that she was basically sex trafficked. I can find no corroborating evidence of that. She, from what I can find, appears to have gone to France of her own volition. But the no mean feat of it is that a woman, supposedly illiterate, in her 20s, was able to find her way all the way back from France. How did she fund it? Did she speak some French? Because many people commented that there was something of the more refined about Mary Jane. So, as with a lot of her life, there is quite a bit of mystery. In 1885, Mary Jane briefly resided with a Mrs. Buchy in lodgings near London Docks North Quay. In the brief period of time that she lodged with Buchy, the two are known to have visited a French lady living in Knightsbridge to demand the return of a box of expensive clothes that had belonged to Mary Jane. This information suggests that her descent into East End life was markedly rapid and may have been influenced by her efforts to avoid retribution from a procurer or pimp. It is also believed that at this stage in her life, when Mary Jane began drinking heavily. After leaving Buchy's residence, Mary Jane lodged with Mrs. Carthy in Breezers Hill in Ratcliffe Highway. According to Mrs. Carthy, Kelly lived at her residence between 1885 and 1886 before leaving to live with a builder whom Mrs. Carthy thought would have married her. Gravitating towards the poorer areas of the East End, she reportedly lived with a man named Morganstone near Commercial Gasworks in Stepney, and later with a mason's plasterer named Joseph Fleming. By 1886, Mary Jane was residing at Cooley's lodging house in Thrall Street, Spitalfields. On the 8th of April, 1887, she became acquainted with a 28-year-old Joseph Barnett, whom she had first encountered on Commercial Street in Spitalfields. Barnett, who worked as a fish porter at Billingsgate Market, he took Mary Jane for a drink before arranging to meet her the following day. The two arranged to live together upon their second meeting on the 9th of April. Initially, Barnett and Mary Jane lodged in George Street, close to Commercial Street. They later took lodgings in Little Paternoster Row, which we see here, but were soon evicted for non-payment of rent and drunken disorderly conduct. They later took lodgings in Brick Lane before relocating to Miller's Court off Dorset Street. Here we see Dorset Street. and this was either in February or March of 1888. And here we see the entrance into Miller's Court. Mary Jane and Barnet moved into 13 Miller's Court, a small, sparsely furnished single room at the back of 26 Dorset Street, Spitalfields. This room had once been at the back parlour of 26 Dorset Street and was partitioned by a wooden wall. The weekly rent for this room was 4 shillings and 6pence. Mary Jane had lost her door key, instead bolting and unbolting the door through and from an outside window, putting her hand through the broken window beside the door. A German neighbour, Julia Venturi, claimed that Mary Jane had broken this window when drunk, and that a man's coat was frequently placed in the broken window pane to both act as a curtain and to prevent the draught from entering the room. And here we see the full illustration of Mary Jane Kelly from the penny illustrated paper, 24th of November 1888, A Lost Woman, Mary Kelly in Miller's Court, and the arrow points at that broken window pane. According to Mary Jane's friend and neighbour, Lizzie Albrook, Mary Jane was heartily sick of the life she was leading by 1888 and wished to return to Ireland, where her people lived. Her landlord, John Carthy, who we see here, later recollected, she was a very quiet woman when sober, but noisy when in drink. And when drunk, Mary Jane would often be heard singing Irish songs. Although, when intoxicated, she would often become quarrelsome and even abusive to those around her, which earned her the nickname of Dark Mary. Mary Jane's partner, Barnet, Joseph Barnet, he lost his employment as a fish porter in July of 1888, reportedly due to committing a theft. As a result, Mary Jane again resorted to prostitution. According to Barnet, she began to allow other prostitutes to sleep in her room on cold, bitter nights, as she did not have the heart to refuse them shelter. Initially, Barnet was tolerant of this, until he and Mary Jane quarrelled over her sharing her room with a prostitute he knew only as Julia. Barnet subsequently left 13 Miller's Court on the 30th of October, more than a week before Mary Jane's death, taking lodgings at 24 to 25 New Street, Bishopsgate. Nonetheless, between the 1st and the 8th of November, Barnet visited Mary Jane on an almost daily basis, occasionally giving her money. Barnet visited Mary Jane for the last time between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m. on the 8th of November 1888. He found her in the company of a friend of hers named Maria Harvey. Barnet did not stay at the property for long and apologised for having no money to give her. Both he and Harvey left Miller's Court at around the same time. Barnet returned to his lodging house, where he played cards with other residents until falling asleep at about 12:30 a.m. Shortly before Barnet left Miller's Court, Lizzie Aldbrook also visited Mary Jane. She later recollected that Mary Jane was sober, and one of the last things that she had said to her was, "Whatever you do, don't go wrong and turn out as I have." In the early evening, Mary Jane Kelly is known to have had one drink in the 10 Bells public house with a woman named Elizabeth Foster. Fellow Miller's Court resident and prostitute, 31-year-old Mary Ann Cox, who described herself as a widow, unfortunate, reported seeing Mary Jane returning home drunk from the 10 Bells pub and in the company of a stout, ginger-haired man, aged approximately 36, at 11:45 p.m. This man was wearing a black felt bowler hat and had a thick moustache and blotches on his face. Cox and Mary Jane wished each other good night, with Mary Jane adding, "I'm going to have a sing-song." She then entered the room with the man, who closed the door as Cox returned to her own lodgings at 5 Miller's Court. Mary Jane was then heard singing a song, a violet plucked from mother's grave. She was still singing when Cox left her lodgings at midnight and when she returned approximately 1 hour later at 1 a.m. Elizabeth Prater, who resided in the room directly above Mary Jane's, when she went to bed at 1:30 a.m, recalled that the singing had stopped. Unemployed labourer George Hutchinson, who knew Mary Jane Kelly, reported that the two had met at about 2 a.m. on the 9th of November on Flower and Dean Street, and that Mary Jane asked him for a loan of sixpence. Hutchinson claimed to be broke, having spent his money in Romford the previous day. He later stated that as Mary Jane walked in the direction of Thrall Street, she was approached by a man of Jewish appearance and aged about 34 to 35 years. Hutchinson claimed he was suspicious of this man because, although Mary Jane seemed to know him, the individual's opulent appearance made him a suspicious character to be in that area and at that time of night. The man had also made an obvious effort to disguise his features from Hutchinson as the two passed him. Hutchinson later provided the police with an extremely detailed description of the man, right down to the colour of his eyelashes, despite it being the early hours of the morning and the suspect having supposedly tried to hide his features. At the time, many made false claims to try and collect the reward money on offer for the apprehension of Jack the Ripper. So we say no more. Hutchinson reported that he overheard them talking in the street opposite the court where Mary Jane was living. She laughed, complained of losing her handkerchief, and the man gave her a red one of his own. The laughing, and she said, "Oh, I haven't got my handkerchief," and he laughed and said, "Oh, don't worry, you can lend mine." Now this is vulgar, but it's where the term hanky-panky comes into this, because at the time, a lot of women and of prostitutes as well, as a form of contraceptive, they would use a handkerchief stuffed inside themselves to collect these gentlemanly juices and would be pulled out afterwards, and where the term hanky-panky comes from. Hutchinson claimed that he heard Mary Jane state, "All right, my dear, come along. You'll be comfortable." She and the man then walked into 13 Miller's Court. Hutchinson followed them. He saw neither of them leave again, and laying off his watch at about 2:45 a.m. And here we see 13 Miller's Court, Victorian police photograph of the time. Elizabeth Prater, who resided in the room directly above Mary Jane's, and she had been awoken by her kitten walking over her neck, and Sarah Lewis, who had slept at number 2 Miller's Court on the 8th and 9th of November, both reported hearing a faint cry of murder between 3:30 and 4 a.m, but did not react because, as they reported, it was common to hear such cries in the East End of London. Lewis described the cry as only one scream. "I took no notice of it." She claimed not to have slept and to have heard people moving in and out of the court throughout the night. Elizabeth Prater did leave her room at approximately 5:30 a.m. to walk to the 10 Bells pub for a drink of rum. God, that's a girl, isn't she? She saw nothing suspicious. On the morning of Friday the 9th of November 1888, the day of the annual Lord Mayor's Day celebrations, Mary Jane's landlord, John McCarthy, sent his assistant, ex-soldier Thomas Bayer, to collect the rent. Mary Jane was 6 weeks behind on her payments, owing 29 shillings. Shortly after 10:45 a.m, Bowyer knocked on the door, but received no response. He then attempted to turn the handle, only to discover that the door was locked. Bowyer then looked through the keyhole, but could not see anybody in the room. Pushing aside the clothing that was used to plug the broken window pane and the muslin curtains, which covered the windows, Bowyer peered inside the room, first seeing on a side table what he assumed to be a bloody piece of meat. Looking further into the room, he discovered Mary Jane Kelly's extensively mutilated corpse lying on the bed. She is believed to have died between 3 and 9 hours before the discovery of her body. Bowyer ran to the landlord, Mr. McCarthy, who ran back to Miller's Court with him to first verify his claims. He then instructed Bowyer to inform the Commercial Street Police Station. Bowyer ran to the police station, stammering the words, "Another one, Jack the Ripper, awful. John McCarthy sent me, to Inspector Walter Beck." Beck accompanied Bowyer to Miller's Court and immediately requested the assistance of Police Surgeon George Bagster Phillips, who we see here. He also gave orders preventing any individuals from entering or exiting the yard. Beck also arranged for news of the murder to be telegraphed to Scotland Yard and requested the assistance of bloodhounds. The scene was attended by Superintendent Thomas Arnold, Inspector Thomas Reed of Whitechapel's H Division, as well as Frederick Aberline and Robert Anderson from Scotland Yard, who arrived at the crime scene between 11:30 and 1 p.m. And here we see from the police illustrations of the time, Miller's Court. News of the discovery of another Ripper victim spread rapidly throughout the East End. Crowds estimated to number over 1,000 gathered at each end of Dorset Street, with many members of the public voicing their frustration, anger and indignation at the news that the fact that the culprit still hadn't been apprehended, and yet there was another murder. Arnold ordered the room broken into at 1:30 p.m. after the possibility of tracking the murderer from the room with bloodhounds was dismissed as impractical. You see the bloodhounds that were used on the streets of London at the time. When they got into the room, a fire fierce enough to melt the solder between the kettle and its spout had burnt in the grate, apparently fueled with woman's clothing. Inspector Aberline thought that Mary Jane's clothes were burnt by the murderer to provide light, as the room was otherwise only dimly lit by a single candle that she had purchased on the 7th of November. Now, when I say extreme trigger warning, I really do mean that with the upcoming images that you're going to see. Because with the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, it was the only murder that occurred within a building inside. So, sadly for her, Jack the Ripper had all the time in the world to do exactly what he wanted. And that room would become Jack the Ripper's playground. And men like George Bagster Phillips and Aberline and the police surgeons and doctors and coroners thought the injuries that were performed upon poor Mary Jane would have taken at least 1 hour. So, I'll talk you through the murder in my own words. This is the original police photograph of the crime scene, and it's graphic enough, you can see. But I am going to talk you through injuries in a minute as we go to more cleared up images. And this is the body of Mary Jane Kelly as discovered in Miller's Court. It's very graphic, I know. And now we'll talk through the injuries. As with the modus operandi of Jack the Ripper with his acknowledged victims, the method of killing was the slitting of the throat, the severance of the carotid artery, which would have resulted in instantaneous or very quick death, thank goodness. And that seems to have been pretty much how he killed a lot of his acknowledged victims. And with Mary Jane, like with one or two of his other victims, he cut her throat with such ferocity that the knife had gone all the way through to the spine and had even nicked the spine and spinal cord. Once she was killed, he laid her on the bed, and he was able to do whatever he wanted. And what you can see to the bottom left is the portion of flesh that was removed from the thigh, which Thomas Bayer first saw. And if we move up from there, we can see her right leg, and that's the exposed thigh bone. He took so much flesh off of her leg that he took it down to the bone, placed the piece of human flesh on the sideboard, and that's what poor Thomas Bayer discovered. He then proceeded to eviscerate poor Mary Jane, to cut her bowels open. He took her intestines out, and if we look down towards the bottom right, we can see the intestines have been removed and placed between her legs. Her hands have been, or one of them has been placed inside the abdominal cavity, the opening and cavity left by what he'd done. Ooh. And then you've got the extreme facial mutilations, which were done with such ferocity that he had taken flesh off to the bone. Her exposed skull could be seen. I am sorry about the graphic nature of these images, but it is part of the story, so I will show it. And this is a crime scene photograph of Mary Jane Kelly, depicting the mutilation inflicted to her lower abdomen, groin and thighs. And a colourised version. What a sick individual, eh? And poor Mary Jane. And interestingly enough, it was among the first of crime scene photographs to be taken. After the two official crime scene photographs had been taken, Mary Jane's body was taken from Miller's Court, as we're going to see in a sec, but this is Mary Jane before and after her murder from the Illustrated Police News, 24th of November 1888. Left side is before and the right side is after. As I said, after the two crime scene photographs had been taken, Mary Jane's body was taken from Miller's Court to the mortuary in Shoreditch. And this is Mary Jane Kelly's body being taken to the mortuary. Also from the Illustrated Police News, 17th of November 1888. And the crowds followed Mary Jane's body all the way from Miller's Court to Shoreditch Mortuary. And it was at the mortuary that Joseph Barnett, who was only able to recognise her body by her eyes, her hair. Bear that in mind, because if you watch my coverage of Jack the Ripper Museum, you will see a piece of Mary Jane Kelly's hair in a frame. And by her undergarments. John McCarthy, her landlord, also viewed the body at the mortuary and was also certain that the deceased lady was Mary Jane Kelly. And here we see Shoreditch Mortuary in 1914. So that gives us, in photographic terms rather than illustrations, a much better term of what we're looking at. And Mary Jane's death certificate. Of all our five ladies, she's the most elusive, the least was known about her, and the most interesting in many regards, because out of all the five canonical victims, as we see in occupation here, she was the only professional prostitute. Her age is about 25 years old, so they didn't know that either. Marie Jeanette Kelly, otherwise Davies. And you can see the cause of death severance of the carotid artery, willful murder against some person or persons unknown, violent. And let's remember Mary Jane in a much nicer way before we head off with this possible photograph of the face of Mary Jane Kelly and the illustration from the newspaper showing Mary Jane Kelly, born circa 1863 to 1888. And now you'll join me back on foot as we head off to our last location.
Well, as we leave the memory of Mary Jane Kelly, Mary Jeanette Kelly behind, and the site of Miller's Court, I take you to our last location in this particular series to discuss with you possible candidates of who was Jack the Ripper. And where I'm going to take you to, I've discussed, haven't I, night shelters, homeless shelters, workhouses, things like that. Where I'm going to take you to now, in 1888, was Providence Row Night Shelter. It's now student accommodation. In the world of 1888, the building we're going to go and see was very much still present. And on the surface of Victoriana, people often think the Victorians were very prudish and prudent with their segregation of men and women in separate places and boys and girls in separate places in school. But when you cast beneath the surface, just like us in our time, they were just the same. I mean, look at some of our ladies that weren't married. They lived in open relationships in an era where you don't think of people doing that. And we're now on Crispin Street, and with the moon brightly above us, we're looking at what was Providence Row Night Shelter, where you would have gone and paid your in the night shelters, it was either a tuppence to sit up sleeping all night in a chair, or like a bench type of thing, or fourpence for a coffin bed. If you went to some doss houses, you could get something known as a tuppenny hangover, where you'd literally be hanging on what looks like a clothesline. And here you see the women's entrance. It's quite original, this place, because the doorbells and things like that and the shutters still remain. And this round here on this little bit where we're going now is the men's entrance, or was the men's entrance. And the original is what I like. You still have its original gated shutters, and just there, the doorbell. But now I'm gonna, as Matt did on our original tour, discuss with you who was Jack the Ripper. Who did people think and have thought Jack the Ripper was? We go into this a lot more on were there more victims, which is another piece I've done. Check that out. So off we go for who was Jack the Ripper.
Who was Jack the Ripper? There have been many theories, both at the time of 1888 and in the years since, that have offered up possible candidates for Jack the Ripper. Some plausible and some not so plausible. And I'll go through the main candidates that Matt spoke us through on the original tour, but I do cover more possible candidates in my other video of were there more victims, so see that for other possible candidates. But firstly, in this one of the people that have been mooted as being a possible candidate for Jack the Ripper was Queen Victoria's grandson, Prince Albert Victor. And some authors argued that he was the serial killer known as Jack the Ripper, or that he was otherwise involved in the murders. but contemporaneous documents show that Albert Victor could not have been in London at the time of the murders, and the claim is widely dismissed. He, of course, was the grandson of the great and powerful Queen Victoria. And the whole thing around this theory with him was that he liked, shall we put this politely, going with lower class women. And that he did go with a lower class woman, not a prostitute, but someone of a much lower station in life than him, and had a child with this woman. And the whole theory is that Queen Victoria sent her people out to have this whole incident covered up, and that the royal physician, Dr. William Gull, who you see here, was involved in the whole thing. And Mary Jane Kelly comes into our little story here because this illegitimate royal baby was supposed to have been being at one point cared for, as the story goes, by Mary Jane Kelly. And the story was getting around that she was in the possession of an illegitimate royal baby. So the story goes that William Gull, along with others, murdered these 5 women in order to cover up the doings of Prince Albert Victor. There is practically no evidence to back any of this up. Prince Albert Victor was never in any of the places at the time, and Dr. William Gull, who was supposed to have been the murderer or very closely involved in that regard, he'd had a stroke 6 months previously and could barely walk across the room by 1888, let alone wield a knife to create the degree of damage that was done, particularly to Mary Jane Kelly. So that's that little story. But from it came the film starring Johnny Depp called From Hell. Have a watch of that one and have a read up of the Prince Albert Victor, was he Jack the Ripper? Type that in and it comes up with a lot more information. And the next suspect is Dr. Francis Tumblety, the womb collecting weirdo. He lived in London at the correct times and was homosexual, with a violent hatred of women. When he was younger, he was married to a woman who, it is said, left him to become a prostitute, thereby causing his extreme hatred of women and prostitutes. He left London for New York just 2 days after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. Francis Tumblety, born circa 1833 and died the 28th of May 1903. He was an Irish-born American medical quack who earned a small fortune posing as an Indian herb doctor throughout the United States and Canada. He was an eccentric self-promoter and was often in trouble with the law. He has been put forward as a suspect for the notorious unsolved Jack the Ripper murder spree in Whitechapel in London in 1888. The Metropolitan Police arrested Tumblety on the 7th of November 1888 on unrelated charges of gross indecency, apparently for having been caught engaging in a homosexual encounter, which was illegal at the time. Whilst awaiting trial on this charge, he was on bail for £300, which is the equivalent of £42,000 today, and knowing that Scotland Yard was increasingly interested in him with regard to the recent murder spree in Whitechapel, he fled England for France on the 20th of November under the false name of Frank Townsend, and on the 24th of November 1888 he made the return journey to the United States. American newspaper reports that Scotland Yard tried to extradite him have not been confirmed by research in the contemporary British press or the London police files. However, English Police Inspector Walter Andrews travelled to America, perhaps partly to trace Tumblety. The New York City Police, who had him under surveillance, said there is no proof of his complicity in the Whitechapel murders, and the crime for which he is under bond in London is not extraditable. After the murders, and some years after the murders, Tumblety was known to enjoy showing his collection of wombs in jars to shocked dinner guests around the dinner table. But at the time there was no way of telling whom or where these wombs had actually come from. Interestingly enough, at the time of his death in 1903 in Missouri, USA, it is well known that he had on his fingers 2 cheap gold imitation rings, just like the ones that Annie Chapman wore. And the next theory is Mary Jane Kelly, our mystery lady. One of the theories is that she may have been married and that she fled from a husband, and then that husband was so devastated or shamed by what she had done to him that he became Jack the Ripper and killed the 4 women before her as a warning to Mary Jane, and then killed Mary Jane lastly. Another person that was mooted and mentioned at the time as being a possible murderer was Mary Jane Kelly's long-term and last partner, Joseph Barnett. The whole thing with this comes into the extreme severe damage and mutilation that was done to Mary Jane's body. Facial mutilations, as was explained to us on night 1, are often done by people who are very closely linked to the person. It's quite unusual to have a stranger perform real hardcore facial mutilations on another stranger. There's normally a personal link there. And also we have to remember that Mary Jane Kelly's heart was taken out. Her heart was removed from the body, which would not have been an easy thing to do, particularly by the light of a raging fire and a single candle. And the theory in that is, and it's morbid to us, but in the Victorian era and before, some people, when they died, they had their hearts taken out and they were enshrined in little lead boxes. Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, had her husband's heart enshrined like that and kept it with her all her life. And the theory is that either this mystery husband of Mary Jane Kelly's or Joseph Barnett may have been so hurt that she had done that to him by becoming a prostitute, that she had taken his heart, so he took hers. And this is a painting from 1908, so 20 years after the murders, and the theory of Joseph Barnett was still being mooted as a possible candidate. And this is a painting of Joseph next to Mary Jane's body, painted in 1908. And at the time, in 1888, and in the 1890s, there was a theory of Jill the Ripper. Detective Aberline was one of the first to put forward an idea that the Whitechapel murderer might be a woman. After the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, one of the witnesses interviewed following Mary Jane Kelly's murder was adamant that she had seen the murder victim alive and seriously hungover hours before the body was discovered. Mrs. Caroline Maxwell insisted that she had seen her outside the Britannia public house wearing a dark shirt, a velvet bodice and a maroon-coloured shawl, the last of which she'd seen Mary Jane Kelly wearing many times. And here we see Frederick Aberline, who first mooted "May there be a Jill the Ripper." This led Aberline to ponder aloud, do you think it could be a case of Jack the Ripper, but Jill the Ripper? The idea was that a midwife would be the only type of woman capable of killing in such a gory way. Rumours that Mary Jane was pregnant at the time of her death fed into the theory. Due to a midwife's easy access to other women's homes, no one would look twice at a midwife with blood on her clothing, or moreover, she could slip away from her crime scene unnoticed, the way the Ripper was notorious for doing. And a prime suspect for Jill the Ripper was a lady called Mary Piercy. Now Google her and read her up. It's a whole other murder case thing that would take an entire video of its own to cover. So do have a read. Mary Piercy was brought in to fill the role of a top female suspect long after her execution, which was December the 23rd, 1890. Piercy's known crime was nearly as gruesome as the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, and perhaps even more so, since one of her victims was an 18-month-old child. So she was a murderer of more than one victim, and as I say, read her up because it's an interesting theory. The Hampstead Murder Mystery. So type that in, Mary Piercy, the Hampstead Murder Mystery, and you'll see another interesting one. Aaron Kosminski, the Polish Jewish barber who was eventually committed to an asylum, and whom is Russell Stephen Edwards' only candidate for Jack the Ripper. Here we see a original with a modern photo fit to show us what Aaron Kosminski would have looked like. Kosminski was a Polish Jew who emigrated from Congress, Poland to England in the 1880s. He worked as a hairdresser in Whitechapel in the East End of London, where a series of murders ascribed to the unidentified person nicknamed Jack the Ripper were committed in 1888. From 1891, Kosminski was institutionalised after he threatened his sister with a knife. He was first held at Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum and then transferred to Leavesden Asylum. Despite an extensive police investigation, the Ripper was never identified and the crimes remained unsolved. Years after the end of the murders, documents were discovered that revealed the suspicions of the police officials against a man referred to as Kosminski. Here we see Sir Melville MacNacton. In 1894, a memorandum written by Sir Melville MacNacton, the Assistant Chief Constable of the London Metropolitan Police, names one of the suspects as a Polish Jew called Kosminski, without a forename. MacNacton's memo was discovered in the private papers of his daughter, Lady Abercronway, by television journalist Dan Farson in 1959. MacNacton stated that there was strong reasons for suspecting Kosminski because he had a hatred of women with a strong homicidal tendencies. And here we see the 1894 memorandum written by Sir Melville MacNacton, Assistant Chief Constable of the London Metropolitan Police, naming Kosminski as one of the 3 suspects in the Jack the Ripper case. The other 2 suspects who he names in this I go into in my other video of were there more victims. So, as I said, if that's something you'll be interested in, give that a watch. In 1910, Assistant Commissioner Sir Robert Anderson claimed in his memoirs, The Lighter Side of My Official Life, that the Ripper was a low-class Polish Jew. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, who led the Ripper investigations, named the man as Kosminski in notes handwritten in the margin of his presentation copy of Anderson's memoirs. He added that Kosminski had been watched at his brother's home in Whitechapel by the police, that he was taken with his hands tied behind his back to the workhouse, and then to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum. A letter unearthed in a university library on the other side of the world describes how one of the main suspects in the case, Aaron Kosminski, pictured above, had attacked an acquaintance with a pair of scissors less than a year after the killings. The document was apparently found in an old book in Australia during a clear-out of stock from the University of Melbourne's Theology Department. Here we see the letter. Pause to read if you want to read it, and if you can make out the handwriting. I'm not great with old handwriting, I must admit. The letter, sent in 1889 from Reverend William Patrick Dott, tells of an attack on a woman named Mary by Kosminski, who ran screaming at her with scissors in the East End. Aaron Kosminski, who Russell Stephen Edwards claims was the killer, known around the world as Jack the Ripper. Here we see the image of him. On the 7th of September 2014, Jerry Longlean, an expert in historic DNA analysis, announced that he had been commissioned by British author Russell Edwards to study a shawl that is said to have been found with the victim Catherine Eddowes, and that he had extracted mitochondrial DNA that matched the female line descendants of Eddowes and mitochondrial DNA that matches the female line descendants of Kosminski's sister from the shawl. And here we see the bloodstained shawl, which belonged to one of the Ripper's victims, Catherine Eddowes. And as I said on our first tour, at the end of it, head over to Russell Stephen Edwards' page, because even if you don't buy into the whole shawl theory and the DNA thing, because there is some conjecture with it from people, you'll really enjoy a lot of his other work. Some of the things he's had done, like he's having plaques made at the moment to commemorate the ladies, which I think is an absolutely lovely thing. He takes some great and cracking pictures around the East End and other parts of the UK as well. But what do you think? Who do you think was Jack the Ripper? Let me know in the comments section. And as I say, I do go into other further potential suspects in Were There More Victims, so do check that video out. One of them, his last words on the gallows were, "I'm Jack the," and he never got any more out because he was plunged into eternity before he could say any more. Well, that's enough talk about Jack the Ripper, and I'd like to end this tour off with what the tour really has been all about. The ladies: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, who came all the way from Sweden, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, who by 1888 was heartily sick of her life and was planning to change and go back to Ireland. So let's bear a remembrance of each one of those ladies, rather than Jack.